In 1949, the Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded for a procedure that had already been performed on more than 40,000 people. The operation took 10 minutes. The instrument was identical in design to an ice pick, and the doctor who popularized it wasn't operating in a hospital. He was traveling across the United States in a van he called the Lobomobile, pulling into state institutions, performing dozens of operations a day, and driving to the next town. By the time anyone seriously questioned the procedure, more than 50,000 Americans had undergone it. One of them was the sister of a future president. She walked into that room able to read, write, and dance. When it was over, she couldn't speak in complete sentences. She spent the next 64 years in an institution in Wisconsin. She never left, and she was never told what had been done to her. The doctor's name was Walter Freeman. He was not a surgeon. The American Board of Neurology and Psychiatry had never certified him to cut. But in 1936, Freeman and his colleague James Watts introduced a procedure they called transorbital lobotomy, based on the work of a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz. The procedure was simple. A metal instrument, shaped like an ice pick, later replaced by a purpose-built tool called an orbitoclast, was inserted through the thin bone above the eye socket. Freeman would hammer it into position with a mallet, then move it back and forth to sever the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. No operating room, no surgical license, often no anesthesia, a brief electric shock to render the patient unconscious. Then the pick went in. 10 minutes later, it was done. And what came next should have stopped the entire practice in its tracks. But it didn't. Because Freeman didn't work in secret. He worked in front of cameras. In 1941, the Saturday Evening Post ran a feature on him. The headline, "Turning the Mind Inside Out." The article described the procedure as a promising new treatment. It mentioned side effects the way you'd mention mild weather. And when psychiatric conferences pushed back, when colleagues warned him that severing brain connections without understanding them was reckless, Freeman responded by performing more procedures, more publicly, more quickly. He once lobotomized 25 patients in a single day at a hospital in West Virginia. 25 people, one doctor, one ice pick, one afternoon. The hospital thanked him, and nobody asked what happened to the 25 patients who woke up afterward, because that wasn't the question anyone was paying Freeman to answer.
Freeman believed he had found the answer to one of medicine's most terrifying problems: severe psychiatric illness, depression, psychosis, schizophrenia. In the 1930s, there was almost nothing. No drugs, no therapies that worked reliably. State hospitals were overcrowded, underfunded, and unable to treat the patients locked inside. Freeman offered a solution. The problem wasn't the theory. The problem was that he never tested whether it actually worked. No controlled clinical trials, no control group, no long-term follow-up. The Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, 1948, published a Freeman and Watts study reporting satisfactory results in 63% of cases. I looked up their definition. Satisfactory meant the patient no longer requires institutional care. Not recovered, not improved, not able to hold a job or recognize their own children. Just no longer a problem for the institution. That was the medical standard. Published, peer-reviewed, celebrated. But here's what the journals never reported. Freeman drove across the country in his converted van. He would arrive at a state hospital,
demonstrate the technique on 1 or 2 patients, then perform the procedure on dozens more before leaving. Hospitals welcomed him, not because the outcomes were good, because the outcomes were quiet. Difficult patients stopped being difficult. Agitated patients stopped being agitated. Women who had been committed for what their intake forms called domestic troubles or religious excitement, the same diagnoses that had been used to institutionalize women since the 1860s, stopped speaking up. The lobotomy did exactly what the institutions needed it to do. It didn't cure anyone, it simplified them. And this is where the numbers tell a story the journals never did. United States, 40 to 50,000 lobotomies between 1936 and 1967. United Kingdom, 17,000. But the country that should disturb you most is Sweden. Sweden performed 4,500 lobotomies, proportionally the highest rate per capita of any country in the world. In 2000, the Swedish State Commission on Medical Ethics published its investigation. What they found was that the procedure had been applied far beyond what the evidence ever supported. Patients were lobotomized for conditions as minor as chronic fatigue and persistent anxiety. One Swedish case from 1951 documented in the Commission's report. A woman committed after refusing to return to her husband. She was lobotomized within 6 weeks of admission. No psychiatric diagnosis beyond the word difficult, the same word they used for Rosemary Kennedy. In every country where the procedure was widespread, one number is consistent. Approximately 60% of lobotomy patients were women. The admission criteria for psychiatric hospitals in the 1940s were identical to those from 80 years earlier. Novel reading, political excitement, ill treatment by husband, laziness, imaginary female trouble. Those are real entries from real admission logs, documented, filed, and accepted without question. A woman whose husband wanted her gone could be committed on his signature and one doctor's agreement. And once she was inside, the lobotomy required only one more signature. His, not hers. Different decade, different institution, same power structure. The lobotomy didn't end the system. It updated the tool. But the case that makes the entire system visible is one name: Rosemary Kennedy. She was the third child of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, born in 1918 with mild intellectual disabilities, possibly from oxygen deprivation at birth. By her early 20s, she was described in family correspondence as difficult, prone to mood swings, occasionally defiant. In 1941, Joseph Kennedy, without consulting his wife, without informing Rosemary, without seeking a second medical opinion, arranged for Freeman and Watts to perform the procedure. She was 23 years old. The operation took place at George Washington University Hospital. During the procedure, Watts later described asking Rosemary questions as he cut. When her answers became incoherent, he stopped. Before the surgery, Rosemary could read and write. She attended a school in Washington where staff described her as engaged and social. She could dance. She could hold conversations. After the surgery, she could not walk without support. She could not speak in complete sentences. She lost control of basic bodily functions. She was placed in St. Coletta Institute in Jefferson, Wisconsin in 1949. She remained there until her death in 2005, 64 years. Her family did not visit her for 20 years. The Kennedy family's public narrative made no mention of her at all until 1960, when her sister Eunice's advocacy work made concealment impossible. Joseph Kennedy never spoke about the procedure publicly, not once. What he said privately we know from a single source, a letter to a family friend, written shortly after the surgery. He wrote that she was much better. Rosemary Kennedy spent 64 years in that institution, and the man who did it to her continued practicing for another 26 years after her surgery. Was Freeman a monster? That's not the right word. Monsters know what they're doing. Freeman's 1948 textbook is not the work of a man who knew he was causing harm. It is the work of someone convinced he had found the answer. The Nobel Committee agreed. The hospitals agreed. The families who signed the forms agreed. Not because they were evil, because the system gave them no reason to look closer. And the real question isn't who Freeman was. The real question is who let him continue.
The American Psychiatric Association formally opposed the transorbital lobotomy in 1948, 12 years after Freeman began performing it. And even then, the procedure continued for nearly 2 more decades. In 1967, Freeman performed a lobotomy on a woman named Helen Mortensen. It was the 3rd time he had operated on her. She died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Her death ended her surgical career. He died in 1972, still defending the procedure. The last documented lobotomy in the United States was performed that same year, 1967, on a 12-year-old boy. He was 12. The year was 1967. The Beatles had just released Sgt. Pepper. The Summer of Love was underway, and somewhere in the United States, a 12-year-old child was placed in a chair, given an electric shock, and a metal instrument was driven through the bone above his eye. His name is not in the public record. His outcome is not in the public record. What is in the record? The admission form, signed by his parents, the institution's name, the date, a note from the attending physician listing the reason for referral. I requested the file through a State Freedom of Information Act. The file exists. It has not been released. A 12-year-old boy, a form, a signature, and then silence. Today, there are approximately 50,000 people alive in the United States who received a lobotomy. Most are elderly. Many have no memory of the procedure. Some were never told. Their medical files, where they exist, describe a surgical intervention. They do not describe what was taken. If someone in your family entered a psychiatric institution between the 1930s and the 1960s and came back a different person, this is where to start looking. The National Archives, state hospital records, the Kennedy family papers at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, partially available since 2012. The answers are in the files. Most of the files are still closed. Rosemary Kennedy died in 2005. She was 86. 64 years in an institution in Wisconsin. She never learned what had been done to her, or maybe she knew, she just couldn't say it anymore. In 2023, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library released additional family correspondence from the 1940s. Among the documents, a note from Joseph Kennedy to the director of St. Coletta Institute, dated March 1949. It read, "Please do not discuss her condition with anyone outside the family. There is nothing to be gained by it." Nothing to be gained. A form, a signature, and then silence. It's the same pattern I find at the end of every thread I pull. Not a conspiracy, not a villain, just a system that made it easy to remove a person and no one whose job it was to stop it. But the lobotomy erased individual minds, one operation at a time. Across the Atlantic, another system was finding a way to erase identity on a far larger scale. Not patients, not adults classified as mentally ill. Newborns. 300,000 of them. Their mothers were told the babies died at birth. The babies were alive. That story starts in a hospital delivery room
in Spain in 1945, and it continued quietly, officially, with paperwork until the 1990s.